Hey, praise the Lord, guys. I'm Straw Greenhorn. And the king was exceeding sorrowful. Nevertheless, for the oath's sake, for those that sat with him, he would not reject her. So immediately the king sent for an executioner and commanded the head of John the Baptist be brought. So he went into the prison and beheaded him, and brought his head in a charger and gave to the damsel. The damsel gave to her mother. Now when his disciples heard what happened, they came and took up his corpse and laid it in a tomb. So the death of John the Baptist. We saw how the events led up to his death, where King Herod had taken his brother's wife, Herodias, whose name his brother's name was Philip. So Herod married Herodias, and John the Baptist, being a just man that he is, he spoke out against it. And it said that the king sent forth and laid hold on him and bound him in prison. Now it does not say how long he was in this prison for, but it was long enough for time to pass where it was the king's birthday that came around, and her daughter danced before the king, and the king, he was so merry with wine in the presence of his lords, being carried away by the lust of the flesh. He made an oath to give her whatsoever she would ask, up to half of his kingdom. Now, if you know, this is an insanely thing to do. I mean, how much is a kingdom worth? I guarantee you, it's not worth one single dance. So we see here, the final completion of the task. We see the king being exceeding sorrowful. Because as much as John spoke out against it and he was angry, he did not believe that John the Baptist, deserved losing his life over this. So we see him here being very sorrowful. The previous verse it said where he heard him greatly and did many things, for he feared John because he was a just man and holy, and he observed them. There was a lot of respect here. The whole people considered John to be a prophet, and that's why he was hesitant at first to put him to death when it was under his own will. That's why he kept him bound in prison, because the ultimate restrainer was the people, because he feared that there would be an uproar. And he did respect him, but it didn't seem as if the respect was enough to not, take his life. It was rather the fear of what the people would do. So, he kept him there in prison. Back then, the king's word was law. Whatever he said went. Even though we do see a lot of corruption now, where, in small areas where there's not many people and it's not too industrialized, things like this does happen where, a police officer maybe will imprison somebody without really having a reason to. And, there's nobody there to, do, just process. There's nobody there to do, to maintain, to monitor something like that. In the backwoods, in the country, small country towns where there's just one sheriff. So we see the damsel here consulting with her mother because she didn't know what to ask for, and the mother, instead of asking for like riches, because that's what she really was after, marrying kings, leaving her husband and marrying who was his brother, the king. There's no other motivation for this woman but power and money and fame. Why didn't she just ask for these things? And like I said in my last video, if this was a booby trap, if it was, a fleeting moment that, he would change, then why not just ask for riches, certain amount of, talents of gold or silver, as they did in those days. So we see him sending an executioner to behead John in prison, then the head being brought to her, as she requested in a charger. And then we see his disciples coming and taking the body. So now, one obvious question the Bible does not answer, I wonder how many people would ask. We know that she took his head in that charger. Was the head returned? Did they bury a headless body? I know many people maybe have not thought about this question, but this seemed to me like a trophy to her. But in those days, there was no refrigerator, so how would she keep it? But they did mummify people, so I guess salt, the Egyptians, they were big on that. Did they bury a headless John the Baptist? When she got that head, I know she must have felt very pleased, a relief, because, he wasn't around to rebuke them anymore. And, having this whole band of scribes and Pharisees, chief priests and elders, Sadducees, no one was saying anything about it, about, him marrying his brother's wife. So I guess she could go back to peace, knowing that, because first of all, they didn't have the integrity to call something out like that. They lacked the integrity, and surely they would have been fearful for their lives. Now imagine seeing this great John the Baptist get beheaded for speaking out against this. I'm sure they left that alone. When she got the head, I would love to see. I bet she was saying things to herself. I bet she was, because, it said that she had a quarrel against him and would have killed him, but she could not. If the king himself was so hesitant, surely she couldn't just show up and put that, into motion. But now here's a perfect opportunity, promise to give you whatsoever you want, and you ask for this. When she got the head, did she speak to it? Did she taunt it? Did she say things like, yeah, I bet you're not gonna say nothing now. I dare you to say something now. Yeah, you see, I win. What did she say to this head when she got it? Because, she was in such a heated, state. that for surely she spoke to this head when she got it. I can just imagine it now. Did she have it mounted on the wall? What did she do with it? All right, let's get into these scriptures. It starts out saying, "And the king was exceeding sorrowful. Nevertheless, for the oath's sake and for them which sat with him, he would not reject her." So the king, he was exceeding sorrowful. We see another king being, sorrowful about essentially putting somebody to death. Daniel. When the king had put Daniel in the lion's den, it is said that, all night he did not eat anything. He couldn't eat. I doubt he even got any sleep. First thing in the morning, he ran to the den where the lions were, and he called out for Daniel, saying, "Daniel, thy gods whom thou serve, were they able to protect thee?" And Daniel spoke, said, "Yes, my God's angel, he sent his angel, and they shut the lion's mouth." So that king, he was exceeding sorrowful. Essentially, he killed Daniel because he put him in the lion's den, and that was it, right? But the God that Daniel served. So now here we see John the Baptist, about to be beheaded, and this king, he is sorrowful. And we see the same principle happening. The king weren't being unable to change. Because those which had accused Daniel, I said in my last video, when they made the decree, when they made him make the decree that no one should serve no other gods but this king and his gods for the next, I believe, was it 21 days, 20 days, whatever, days it was. And then when Daniel violated this by praying to, the God of Israel, when they came to the king, they made sure to say these words. Know that the decree of the king of the Medes and Persians, once it goes out, it cannot be altered. So even you, king, are a slave to your own word. And even though they didn't say it directly here, this king, Herod, Bible says, nevertheless, for the sake of them that sat with him, and for the oath's sake, that he could not, reject her. I said in my last videos, principles, being able to understand, honor and dishonor, being able to understand that it's really you, because, the dilemma that he's getting in, he's seen himself blended with these people, understanding life that is you and your boundaries, your principles, your morals, he's unable to separate himself from them. What if he had just given a simple speech, I know what I said, and I really had good intentions when I said it. I didn't think that you would ask for something like this. Even turn it around on them. What is this that you're asking for? You're asking for this man's head? Why? But then he could continue his speech saying, well, this man is an honorable man of God, and he has helped me through many things, and I do look to him for, advice and counsel on certain things. Man up, king. It would be completely, dishonorable, given all the circumstances of this whole situation, for me to, do something like that. I know that I am the king and my word is final, but this is my final word. Because honor. We gotta remember honor. Make it about because what they're doing, they're taking control of the frame of the situation. If you ever heard the concept of a frame, it's basically the point of view of how things are interpreted. If you walk into a place and you see somebody being murdered, your first reaction is gonna be like, "Whoa, what happened?" Like, how could you? I mean, that's a human being, and then you would even be concerned, like, somebody's got to know about this. But then you stand around for 5 seconds and they tell you, you know what, he just killed 3 little kids around the corner, and he's running around shooting people, so we had to take him out. And you'd be like, "Oh, okay, I understand." It's a frame. One thing that happens, how it's viewed and interpreted, because they were trying to create the frame that the king would have been a weakling if he would have changed his word. They were trying to create the frame that would have been dishonorable for him to change his word. When he could have, set the whole thing straight. Say, listen, this is dishonorable if we do this, and I will not be a part of something like this. And he could have spoke about it some more, just to let them understand just how, primitive and disgusting they were being by even requesting something like this. How about you look at this woman and say, when I married you, I never thought that something like this would be inside of you. It's like, you're letting them force your hand, down this bad path instead of taking control of the situation. You are the king. Is it your word that is final, or is it your principle that is final? Yeah, I know I gave my word saying this, but my values, they do not allow this. And I'm appalled that you guys would try and back me down into a corner to let me do something this, terrible. All right, so the next one, it says, so then immediately the king sent for an executioner and commanded the head of John to be brought. And he went into the prison and beheaded him. This executioner, was he also the jailer? Did he have conversations with John the Baptist? Because I'm sure if they did, John would have enlightened him about certain things. When Paul was in prison, it says that he was given favor. The prisoners, they heard him, the things that he spoke concerning God. When Joseph was in prison, same thing. Even though Joseph was not as much a preacher, but they were given great favor and everybody knew them. Things were committed, under their leadership, even in prison. This was no doubt at night or even in the evening. How far did they have to send for this executioner? Was he at home, in bed with his wife and children? So he commanded, the executioner to bring forth his head, and he went forth in the prison and beheaded him. I wonder how they brought this news to John the Baptist. I imagine that when they went in there, it was unscheduled. There's maybe a schedule that they come and they check on them a certain time. They bring them food a certain time. They take them to the bathroom a certain time. There's like scheduled things, right? So, this, visit, when they came to him, was he able to see it on their faces? Did the angel of the Lord, warn him that this was what's going to happen? Did he get any warnings from God? When they showed up, could he not see it on their body language? How did they explain it to him that we're here to behead you? We're here to behead you. How do you tell somebody that? We're here to behead you. Worse when you know that this is a righteous man. He did no wrong, and that the people that are coming against him, they are the ones that are wrong. Did John cry? I mean, how did he take this news? Did it just bounce off him? Was he resilient? Did he break down a little? So the king commanded his head to be brought. The mom wants that head. So it was brought. So they didn't see the execution itself. They didn't see them cutting off his head. They didn't see the execution itself. Was it by guillotine? Was it by axe? How did they take, his head off, physically? It said it was brought to them. So, as I imagine God spared him from having this woman look at him being executed. The taunting she would have done. The making faces at him, the smiling that she would have done. I believe God spared John from that moment. They just brought his head. So he sent the executioner and beheaded him. This would have been really hard for him to stand in the presence of this lady, because she actually had a quarrel with him. You know, it had become an ego battle. Even though she was wrong. The grinning, the defiance, that she would have done. So in the next one it says, and his head was brought in a charger and given to the damsel, and she gave it to her mother. Something I've been wanting to say, I keep forgetting. A charger. There's only one other time we've seen this word used in the Bible. It was in the book of Numbers when they were dedicating, the Ark of the Covenant that Moses was commanded to build. They brought a silver charger of 130 shekels, a silver bowl of 70 shekels, full of fine flour mingled with oil. And they brought the animal sacrifice. You know how they did, when they were dedicating something, sanctifying it. And now we see a charger being used to carry the head of John the Baptist. So, I mean, I imagine that beheading somebody must have been a messy thing. Blood that, gets about the place. No doubt they had to wash this head, to clean it up. So he gave it to the damsel. The damsel gave it to her mother. Did not this king then know that there's something wrong with this lady? King, of all the women in your kingdom that you could have, first of all, she used to be your brother's wife. I mean, you can pick from the best of the land, right? You can find yourself a Bathsheba. Abraham Sarah said that she was so beautiful. When the men saw her, they recommended her to Pharaoh. You can find yourself a Sarah. You find yourself a Mona Lisa, a Helen of Troy. But in today's term, we would say your brother's leftovers, right? Did you have an ego battle with him? Were you trying to show him something? And now, this is the kind of heart she has, a heart like this. So then it says, then his disciples, when they heard what happened, came and took his corpse and laid it in a tomb. So his disciples came. So remember, during all these things, Jesus was by himself. He had just sent his disciples, two by two, giving them power over unclean spirits, telling them, commanding them, to take nothing for the journey, but a sandal and a staff only. No bread, no scrip, no money for the purse. Take not two coats. Whatsoever house you enter in, there abide till you leave. If they will not hear you nor receive you, shake off the dust of your feet for a testimony against them. I am Straw Greenhorn.